Hi, my name is Angie. I'll be presenting our paper Data Proofs as Boundary Objects for Technology Policy Design, Demystifying Technology for Policymakers, and Aligning Stakeholder Objectives in Rideshare Gig Work on behalf of myself, Rocita, Rana, Alexander Boltz, Veena Dubal, and Kyung. Presently, the US lacks a comprehensive policy to regulate app-based platforms like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Amazon Flex. Even more concerningly, the US lacks policy to uphold labor rights of gig workers on these digital platforms. This is especially concerning to implications on labor, given that the number of people engaged in gig work in the US continues to grow, with some reports finding that a majority of them are dependent on this work for meeting their basic needs. What does this mean for workers? Well, in this current state of affairs, it means implications such as, but not limited to, platform fees and the commissions that platforms take being variable and determined opaquely. Workers are often left to sort this out themselves, finding from experience that the commissions have been increasing over time. Unclear termination reasons or appeal methods that will lead to lost wages while workers' cases are researched, often without their input. And confusing contract language that masks things such as defaulting workers to agreeing to ceding their rights to arbitration. To the right here is a screenshot of an example of a terms of service update from Uber with such language. Given the proliferation of gig work platforms today, and the swath of literature and reports documenting how platforms control workers, take away their autonomy, negatively impact their well-being, lead to subpar working conditions and wages, why do policy and regulation around technology like these platforms still lag? Or asked another way, what role can HCI play in making evident the impacts of technology on workers in order to design effective policy? To explore this, we turn to data probes. Introduced in our study with rideshare drivers last year at CHI, data probes are interactive visualizations or tools built using the worker's own data to help them contextualize data patterns. In that study, we explored 5 different types of data probes with Uber drivers. You can read our paper for more details on each. I'll explain one as an example right now, and in our findings, I'll describe a few more. This is the animation data probe. It uses a driver's personal Uber driving data, maps out a specific shift on a map of their city while they were working, and they can talk in sync with the animation about how they're working, what's shaping their strategies. One of our implications from this study where we were exploring data probes with workers was that these were effective tools for workers to identify instances of manipulative algorithmic management and then talk about how that affects or shapes their work strategies. For example, using the animation, the driver here was explaining that he's a new dad, works late night hours, and in this particular shift on the animation, he pointed out how at the end of the shift, he was ready to go home, turned on Uber's feature of destination filter to try to get a ride in the direction of home. And instead, as you can see in the animation as well as the call out to the right, he received a trip in the opposite direction of town, led to longer work time and longer unpaid miles and time as he doubled back afterwards to get back home. So given this, and recalling my earlier question about the role of HCI, we ask, what role can data probes play in making evident impacts of technology to design effective policy? More specifically, how might data probes be used by stakeholders for tech policymaking? With this in mind, we conducted 12 interviews with stakeholders of roles that we identified to be crucial to the policymaking process. First, we spoke to 5 policy informers, including individuals in academic roles doing research on economic impacts of gig work, a designer who was part of informing municipal rideshare ordinance, individuals working at institutes and nonprofits that conduct economic policy research around gig work. And these roles are important to policymaking because the research that they do can and has, in some cases, been used to determine whether or not to adopt worker-centered policy, or they garner national attention or policymaking attention about a pressing issue. We spoke to 4 organizers. 3 are worker organizers, having the experience as impacted gig workers, and 1 campaign organizer with extensive experience organizing for rideshare drivers. Organizers are so important for pushing forward worker-centered policy. Especially in the gig work space, workers are so atomized and organizers have played this important role in gathering workers around issues like subpar wages or working conditions. Our observation is that in spaces where worker-centered policy has been successful, even for a time, it's been worker organizers at the helm. We spoke to two litigators who have represented gig workers, rideshare drivers, in lawsuits against platforms. Litigators are another important role in policymaking. They can play a role of interpreting policy or lacking any, helping to argue worker cases. They can also help in crafting the language of upcoming bills and so on. And we spoke to one state lawmaker who has experience of working as an app-based gig worker and also previously drafted a worker-centered bill trying to get workers and consumers of gig work apps more transparency, like how platforms are charging for services. In our study, we explained each data probe, how it worked, how drivers in our past study used it, and we asked participants their thoughts on how they would use it for their domain and ideas for how other stakeholder groups might use it. We also introduced a new data probe called the Questimator, which I'm going to explain in detail in just a few minutes. So participants used data probes or envisioned the use of data probes in order to assist stakeholder interactions in the lawmaking process, demystify platform practices and worker experiences for non-drivers, and enable collective action and worker empowerment. I'm going to dive a little deeper into a couple findings related to demystification, but please check out our paper for more. First, all the participants reacted positively towards the work planner as a tool that can elucidate conditions that workers contend with when they're trying to make a living. So to explain how it works, over here, you can select the specific times for each day on the timetable that you want to work. Then select the neighborhoods that you primarily drive in, and then enter variables that are related to your work and your expenses. This right-hand side generates estimated results correlated to those working conditions you entered. We'll break it down by estimated earnings, expenses, net income, and a comparison to the minimum wage of the city. So this data probe is powered using real Chicago city level rideshare data, and we explain this to the participants. Some very prominent comments from participants was how the work planner helped to make clear expenses that workers take on, especially if they're currently categorized as independent contractors. Many of these expenses that place a noticeable dent in their net earnings are also ones that platforms currently disregard due to assumptions that workers are part-time drivers and driving for disposable income. Participants noted the work planner made evident such contradictions. For example, P1 called out how the work planner provides expense breakdown related to car operating costs. The companies try to argue that only marginal costs should be considered because people would own the vehicles anyway. But that's not true for the set of drivers who do the most miles. And the lawmaker noted how rideshare drivers are almost certainly leasing a car or buying kind of a newer one, a factor that plays a huge role in how much net earnings a driver can earn. We also found how the Questimator was particularly effective in demystifying platform practices of manipulative incentive structures and the impact this has on workers. So platforms often offer incentives to encourage workers to work more, like Uber's Quest. This is a screenshot, and it gives the workers parameters for the days and time range that they have to complete a certain number of trips, the number of trips that they're told they have to complete, and the bonus that they would get after completing it, and then any other parameters that they have to meet. The Questimator here is a data probe that uses Chicago city-level rideshare data. It lets the user input the Quest parameters at the top. Then they can select the hours during that time range that's been specified to them from the app. And then it'll reveal if they're estimated to be able to complete the Quest or how many rides they might end up falling short. So it can illustrate how many hours they will spend working in order to hit that Quest. And participants reacted strongly to this as a helpful tool for policymakers to view, especially given that some of the quests that drivers see can require a large volume of trips over a short period of time, resulting in 12, 16, 20-hour days. Driver organizers in particular have experienced this themselves. And one shared, I can think of 17 people I would like local lawmakers and lawyers to see this, allow them to play with it to understand Drivers get these kinds of offers from Uber, and in order to make a living, you really have to get these bonuses in Quest. So here's what happens when you click a quest, right? Here, try to figure out when you would drive to accomplish this quest. Participants also shared about other rideshare platform concepts the Questimator can help with investigating, such as whether incentive offers might be violating safety compliance rules. When platforms set quests to require such high trips in such a small set of time, P12 wondered, how long would this take relative to like working hours per day and sleep? It's also a consumer safety thing where it's like, if they're rushing to complete this and they're not sleeping, and it's just not attainable. I'll just briefly touch on a couple last takeaways from interviews. I do encourage you to read the paper for more details. Something that became clear over the course of interviews was the importance of this right question when it comes to crafting policy. P10 emphasized that the US has existing regulatory models for dealing with employment exploitation and fair wages, but new technologies with their terminology, different ways of working, presenting themselves can obscure this. Data probes, though, can support understanding how platforms work by illustrating platform manipulation and this impact on workers, and therefore a better understanding of what questions to ask. Thinking back to the quest, maybe regulators and policymakers can ask for specific data from platforms about incentives that workers are being offered. How are those incentives being determined in order to investigate safety compliance? In this way, data probes can also be a tool to remind policymakers and regulatory agencies like the FTC or state commissions that they have specific powers the general public doesn't to requesting data or reports from platforms. Perhaps the data probes can be integrated then in a sort of training session to help accomplish these with policymakers and regulators. Lastly, I just want to leave with this thought, given this increasing datafication of traditional workplaces beyond these gig work platforms, and these calls for clear policy and regulation of generative AI technologies. Could data probes be applied in different ways for these emerging tech policy contexts? So thank you for listening. Here's our contact information, and please reach out if you would like to.